Okay, I think we should get started. Now, welcome everybody to this panel on COVID-19 and higher education. Let me first say that the job market conference, as well as the panel, has been generously funded by the Ministry of Education of the Republic of Korea and the National Research Foundation of Korea, and by the Asian Development Bank. So we very much appreciate your continued support. So the current crisis, which has been induced by the spread of COVID-19, had, of course, dramatic effects on many areas of our economies, but in particular on education. Schools have been closed. There have been difficulties with examining students, and this kind of carried up the chain to universities. Given that this is the virtual AASLE job market, we thought it may be a very good idea to have a panel of world-class experts who will discuss not just the status quo, so how do we think about the crisis given the evidence we have so far, but also give some idea about how we should think about the future, what will happen in the next years, and how will higher education and the higher education job market be affected by this crisis. So we have an excellent panel of panelists. Hanming, Fang is Joseph M. Cohen, a professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has, I think, a joint appointment in Shanghai, Hanming, I think that's correct. He has a wide interest in many areas of applied microeconomics, in particular focusing on public economics, but he has looked at areas like discrimination, psychology, social economics, and many others. Steve Machin is professor of economics at the London School of Economics and director of the Center for Economic Performance. Again, Steve is an expert on education. He also looked at crime, labor markets, etc., and has thought a lot about the COVID crisis. Abigail Payne is professor of economics at the University of Melbourne and directs the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research. Abigail has, like Hanming, worked a lot on public economics, but also economics of education, economics of charities, all issues, all areas which are very much connected to what we want to talk about today. And Michèle Tertilt is professor of economics at the University of Mannheim. She again has worked on the economics of the family, development economics, areas from a macroeconomic perspective that are very much related to our topic today. So the way I wanted to structure this panel is that the panelists will have between 7 and 10 minutes time to share their thoughts with the auditorium in the first round about the challenge the crisis had for pre-university education and how this is likely to impact on university enrollment, how expectations of the way the crisis will affect postgraduate education may impact on enrollment and possibly the subject choice of students, and what the role of universities is to address possibly eminent learning losses of pupils and their very unequal distribution across socio-economic backgrounds. And each panelist will also talk a little bit about the particular area he or she represents. I suggest we start with Michèle and try to restrict every statement to about 7 to 10 minutes. Michèle.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, so thank you very much for including me in this panel. Wait, I have to move to full screen here, I think. Okay. So I prepared some slides. I think the topic of COVID-19 and higher education is very interesting, and there's so many different dimensions affected by the current situation of higher education. So I wanted to touch upon a bunch of different issues very briefly without going too deep, because there's just so many different aspects affected, I think. So first, I think in terms of the pre-university education, right? So thinking about sort of the input into higher education, I think because of the closed schools, you know, sort of the preparation of the incoming students is worse than in normal times. There were some practical issues in terms of delayed high school exams. In Germany specifically, that was not so much an issue because mostly they were just delayed. And then we just started the semester a little bit later than usual. Most German schools actually only start in mid-October. So that delay wasn't so much an issue here. But thinking about next year and beyond, I think sort of the learning losses will be more of an issue due to the closed schools and the virtual learning. I think the students are not as prepared. I'm personally also expecting higher dropout rates at university, but I was looking around, I haven't seen any data on that yet. In terms of the sort of learning losses, this is from an interesting paper. This is data collected in Germany by Dustmann and co-authors. And so basically they were trying to assess in June this year, how much less time kids were spending on sort of school-related activities. And what they document here is basically, you know, even though the schools were virtually open, right? They were supposed to have all these classes, but in terms of time, it was basically halved. So here, going, you know, from 7.4 hours a day to 3.4. The emphasis in that particular paper, and I'm giving all the reference if anyone is interested, was on the differential impact on low achievers. But actually looking at these numbers, to me, the most striking impact is that everyone's spending a lot less time learning. So I'm a little bit worried about the preparation for college. Then this is a paper actually by a colleague of mine who's using such input to simulate then how down the road the school closures affecting college education. And, you know, kind of modeling carefully the complementarities between schools and college and the choices that people make. And so from this simulation, the prediction here is the fraction of college educated population, and this is calibrated to the United States, would decline down the road. And these are different cohorts, C1, C2, so depending on the age that are affected right now. You know, up to 1% or almost 1.5 percentage points lower college enrollment. Now, obviously, a lot of assumptions went into this, but in terms of you know, beyond thinking about the lower qualification of the incoming students, I think subject choices might be affected. At least in Germany, we've seen an increased interest sort of in virology and epidemiology in medicine. But I think also because of the economic crisis, there is a bigger interest in, you know, in economics as well. But again, there I haven't seen any numbers yet. If we look at evidence from the Great Recession, at least in the United States, college enrollment grew by 3 million in the aftermath of the crisis. At the same time, state funding actually declined substantially. And I'm a little bit worried we'll see that same squeeze this time around, in the sense, you know, more demand for higher education, but less funding for it. So we have to do the same thing with less money, or more with less money. I'm a little bit worried. At the same time, maybe demand is actually falling a little bit because, you know, the diminished colleagues experience, because, you know, you're attending virtual classes, some people might not find it worthwhile. Now, how the students learning, the students in, you know, at university now, how are they learning during COVID-19? Most classes, I think everywhere, for sure in Germany, are virtual, for sure for 3 semesters, who knows afterwards. So fall next year might be normal again, let's see. So there's much less interaction than in normal times. I think it's especially hard for the incoming students. It's difficult for some international students who are studying virtually in different time zones. I think it's also hard for the PhD students who are getting started with their own research. I found a paper though, looking at this specifically for data from 4 US universities. I'm citing it here at the bottom. They did not find much diminished learning experience in their data. So that's, you know, so maybe it's not as bad as I think. One thing I'm particularly worried about, and this is based on my own research, is the diversity among the faculty in the future. So one thing basically across the world we all did to fight the pandemic was to close the schools and the daycare centers. That's not just affecting the students, it's also affecting the parents. So, you know, employees with kids had a hard time working. And even now, partial closures, virtual lessons, kids in quarantine, I mean, we're not back to normal yet. That is really affecting parents and faculty ability to work, and especially so mothers. And so I have worked on this extensively since March. And I think thinking about, you know, professors, colleagues, teaching is really hard to cut. No one is completely canceling the classes. So I think most of this will come at the expense of research. So I expect women, especially, I mean, parents in general, but especially women on the tenure track to really be affected. And I think universal extension to tenure tracks won't counteract that. We have seen this, and there's a famous paper by Untitled and co-authors in the AER that parental leave policies, universal across gender, actually hurt women, so increase the gender gap. It's just because mothers in most of our societies are more responsible. It's just a fact of society. So I'm really worried about sort of the gender-specific tenure rates kind of widening, so more women not getting tenure, and that would really lead to less diversity among the faculty in the future. And there's some research already done on this. So especially the COVID economic research, these are publications in NBR and CPR working paper series. And roughly speaking, over the years, about 20% of such research was done by women. Looking at sort of the COVID-related research, it dropped to 12%. This was in May. So, you know, I think that's an indication for this. This is from academic political scientists as another measure of productivity. These are work-related tweets by academic political scientists. And you also see, well, a drop as the pandemic hit in March for everyone, but a change in the gender rankings. So it dropped by more for female scientists. And I think it's mostly related to the childcare issues. And then I know, I mean, I don't have much time, but very briefly, since this is the job market sort of a conference, in terms of the PhD job market, I think there are many different things going on. Clearly, there are fewer job openings this year, especially—
Perhaps Michèle, we wait with that for the second part of the discussion,
okay,
because that fits into the second.
It fits better, the second part.
Okay,
so then let me just stop here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michèle. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure we come back to your statements about female disadvantage, and I really like the Twitter graphs. So let's, I think, just move on to a Hanming, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, for the invitation to participate in this panel. Thanks, Michèle, for very interesting opening remarks. So I personally have started basically working from home from mid-March, and now I think we are essentially 9 months into it. And I'm hopeful that the vaccine that's coming online will end this pandemic, or at least substantially relieve the many effects of the current pandemic. So for my remarks, I will probably focus a little bit more on what I think might be the more long-lasting impact of the pandemic from the habits that we formed, or during this pandemic, right? So let me briefly start out by laying out what I think are the challenges facing the universities before the pandemic, at least from the perspective of the United States, and to some extent, as you'll see, we'll touch upon China as well. The first, I think, the big challenge is the very high and rising cost of higher education in the United States. During the period of from 1985 to 2013, where I have data, the average cost of attending college rose by 538% during that period. In the same period, the general consumer price index rose by 121%. And I also do research on healthcare. And healthcare, often people talk about, very high costs, rising healthcare costs in the US. During that period, the healthcare costs rose by 286%. So, the college cost is very high, and as a result, as in a typical market economy, high cost invites innovation and competition from disruptors. And indeed, there has been attempts to disrupt the higher education. Coursera, EduX, and other MOOC or mass open online course programs were entering the marketplace before the pandemic, but did not make too much of a dent before the pandemic. Somehow, whether it's the in-person instruction at the universities or the credentials that are offered by the universities still command a premium in the labor market. But the pandemic, I believe, may change that, right? Almost overnight, millions of college students in the United States and around the world were forced to switch to online learning, right? It's conceivable that many of the lower ranked universities in-person education model will be drastically replaced by MOOC with certifications of basically, the MOOC programs will be certifying students of that they took and passed classes, right? So this pandemic experience may have long-run impacts on how the Coursera model, EduX model might actually fare in the coming years. The switch will pose challenges to some universities' business models, but it could be also beneficial development for the society as a whole, right? Because it can lower the higher education cost. Into many students, maybe the learning, the instruction may be more effective and the access to higher education may be made more equal as a result of these developments. The second challenge that facing the universities, I thought, is the emergence of AI systems that are drastically reducing the importance of knowing things only, right? So traditionally, universities typically prefer and certify knowledge to students. But as we know, with the rapid development of AI systems, tasks that involve the processing of existing knowledge will be increasingly done by AI systems. Robot doctors can diagnose common symptoms or even less common ones and provide treatment options by accessing large database and medical journal articles much more efficiently than, humans. Robo lawyers can process case laws much faster than paralegals at much lower cost. And algorithm trading already accounts for more than 50% of all the orders processed today. Business reports now can be written by AI writing systems automatically, and it's indistinguishable according to A/B testing about whether the report is written by AI machines or real business reporters. A top teacher can reach millions of students. University have to change in what it teaches because of these developments. Preferring existing knowledge alone is not going to be too useful anymore. It has to be the education model, the way we teach, the way we educate in universities must be knowledge plus something, maybe plus creativity, plus problem solving, plus out-of-box thinking, plus connections, something that I don't know exactly what that plus has to be, but just educating students who to know things is not going to be enough. And I think this is a challenge that all universities will be facing, how to redesign the university education curriculum to change with the technological revolutions that we are facing today. The third challenge I thought for the US and to some degree Australian universities as well is the relationship between China and the US and China and Australia. Many US universities from actually the Great Recession onward was heavily reliant on the tuition revenues from undergraduate and master students from China. In 2019 alone, about 330,000 Chinese students were studying in the US colleges. But now visas are harder to obtain, particularly for STEM majors, and the relationship between US and China also made the US not as a desirable destination for Chinese students. And these will have very significant financial challenges for many American colleges. It, however, offers great opportunities for universities that opened campuses in China, such as NYU Shanghai, Duke, Kunshan, etc. And then many Chinese students or Chinese parents who, with students in college age are thinking about these local campuses of overseas universities as an alternative to sending their kids to study in the US mainland or Australia. These local campuses provide an opportunity to overcome these hurdles, visa hurdles, or possibly anti-China hurdles, and obtain an American-style education. It remains to be seen whether virtually attending American colleges will emerge as an alternative as well. Right now, I think what I'm seeing is in China, many parents express a preference for sending their kids to overseas universities with local campuses in China to attend physically, okay? But virtual attending American colleges might be an alternative coming in the coming years. Finally, let me add that labor market is also awakened with the potentials of remote working during the pandemic. Research papers by Dingle and Neyman have found that 37% of the US jobs can plausibly be performed at home. And Bick, Bladen, and Mertens found that during the peak of the pandemic in May of 2020 in the US, about 35.2% of all the workers who remain employed actually worked from home. So there's a 37% of jobs that can potentially be worked from home, and 35.2% actually worked from home during the pandemic. These habits also were found to be, surveys have found that many workers stated that the habits they formed during the pandemic are likely to stay after the end of the pandemic. It could mean that virtual migration, right? So we have been talking about migration, and this working from home actually made it possible to, quote unquote, have a virtual migration where local workers working for foreign firms virtually, and maybe a new development in the labor market. To the extent that working for foreign firms after graduation is one of the motivations for studying abroad, this new development of virtual migration could have implications about where to attend the universities as well. So I, as a Christian, I will stop my first round remark here. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Hanming, for these really very insightful remarks and considerations. Maybe let me just ask you one question. Michèle pointed out that, well, one impact, the immediate impact of COVID is that females who have other additional duties within the household may be actually disadvantaged by what happened relative to males. Now, you, however, point out that, well, transaction costs of acquiring education may actually decrease, that transaction costs of doing certain jobs may decrease. And that, to me, suggests that if we look at the gender divide, this goes in exactly the opposite direction. Maybe you can just say something about that for 2 minutes.
So for what Michèle mentioned, that because every faculty member or researcher, male or female, is a combination of have to juggle between work and home. And when kids are being forced to study virtually from home, the burden of keeping the family in order might have been disproportionately felt by females. I think that definitely is a challenge for female researchers and female workers in general. For the daughters who are thinking about, who are not raising the family yet, there is a possibility that the potential disruptions to the higher education and the labor market down the road because of the habits formed during the pandemic and might actually be in the longer run. I think the short run and longer run effects might be somewhat divergent. In the longer run, might make access to education more equal, and a labor market may be more friendly to the females as well. So that's of course speculative, but I think what I'm trying to point out is that short run and long run impacts might be somewhat different.
Okay, thanks a lot, Hanming. I'm sure we come back to that in the discussion later. Let's come to the next speaker, Abigail. Will you share your thoughts with us? I think you have some slides.
No, I don't have slides.
Oh, you don't have slides. Okay, good.
So I just have some comments. So thank you, Christian, for putting together a timely and important panel. And I'm very pleased to be a part of it. So I actually want to riff a little bit off of Hanming's comments, because in another context, I've been doing a lot of thought about poverty and disadvantage and the effects of COVID. And one of the things we keep thinking about is, to what extent has COVID, have we adapted to COVID? And so once we get a vaccine, once we kind of get back, we kind of are going to go backwards to where we were at the beginning of 2020. And to what extent have we accelerated expectations of things moving forward? So this notion of the acceleration of online learning, I think is a fascinating area that is worthy of more discussion of whether COVID has actually made us more adaptable and accelerating and accepting of online learning. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on Australia, and let me first just lay a little bit of the context for Australia. So Australia, unlike the US, pretty much all the universities are publicly funded universities. So we don't have the super high tuitions. The country has a reasonably progressive policies to support deferral of tuition payments. So it turns out that when you register and you start attending, you could just tick a box and say, I'm not going to pay my tuition until after I get my degree and I start working. And it goes immediately into the tax system. And you actually don't start paying it back until you start earning money. So I think that's one of the more progressive ways of dealing with, tuition differences. The government also regulates pretty heavily tuition rates. So it's not uncommon that if you're getting a commerce degree or a law degree or a science degree, it doesn't matter what university you're going to. So if you're going to the University of Melbourne, which people have heard of, or you're going to Federation University, which many people probably have not heard of, your tuition would be the same. So that actually kind of creates some kind of odd competition or lack of competition across universities in Australia. But the challenge that Australia before COVID was that, not unlike many other countries, post-secondary education participation remains low for those living in more disadvantaged areas. So while these statistics are kind of back of the envelope, if you look at based on residential population, and there isn't a lot of migration in Australia for Australian-born folks. They tend to reside where they grew up. For those aged 25 to 29, in the more disadvantaged or high poverty communities, you're observing only about 24% of individuals in that age group possessing a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to the more prosperous communities or least disadvantaged, where you're observing closer to half of the population. So this was a problem before we entered into COVID. So I'm actually kind of wondering if there isn't a silver lining with the pandemic, and that the silver lining is that it might be encouraging more training and more education beyond high school, especially by those in disadvantaged communities. Now, at our institute, we've been running a bi-weekly survey where we ask lots of questions. And one of the questions we asked during this time was, we asked whether you're employed, and we also asked whether or not you were thinking of pursuing more skills. And if you look at those that are aged, say, 35 to 49, so those who should be on school, what you can see is that for those that are unemployed or working, identified as just working part-time, a high percentage of them have no intentions. So that's not a good thing. But if you look at those that are age 18 to 34, I would say about 40 to 50% of those individuals have indicated an interest in not only getting more education, but to do so to develop more skills. So in terms of this notion of what's happening as a result of the pandemic, do we need to start to adapt to more skills? Do we need to modify? Do we need a broader educational system? I think that there is a sign that probably we do need to be thinking about that. Now, from the Australian university standpoint, what I'm going to tell you a few things. And because I'm a director and I have a big budget, it means that I have gone through the ups and downs of universities going, we have to cut because we don't have, we're concerned about our international tuition. So Australian universities have become probably overly reliant on international tuitions, which are high, and have fully supported a lot of the positions. So what you kind of see is that the government has said, okay, we're regulating your tuition. You can't charge a higher tuition, and we're only going to give you subsidies for a certain number of positions. So that kind of created an incentive for universities to say, well, how are we going to bring in more revenue? Well, let's just bring in international students, which isn't necessarily a good public policy standpoint. So while you might think this is an opportunity for universities to take on more domestic students, there has been an increase in that, what we call corridor. There has been an increase in that corridor, but not a substantial increase. So universities don't necessarily have that incentive to take on more students to the degree you would think that they might during a pandemic or a recession. So I think that's a challenge. In terms of thinking about how are younger adults going to survive the recession, how are they going to adapt and accommodate changes that are going on. In terms of preparation of students and how they're doing, Australian universities, because the nature of our term, we started in March, right? Our terms, we adapted very quickly to online teaching. We adapted things. In terms of what's happening, frankly, the professors are being asked to teach more hours. And so what the good news is that our budgets haven't been cut as much as we feared, because actually the students are still there. Even our international students are staying in and they're getting their degrees. What that means from a year from now, because even though I'm in a place where we kind of have 0 cases, we're still not back in the office. And so, but we're still planning on teaching online, for the first half of next year, or it will be more blended learning. So the face-to-face interaction is going to be more limited, and the opportunities for our international students to come back to Melbourne will be a little bit more limited while we wait for the government to open up kind of our borders to international visitors or students. On the gender challenges for Michèle, we universities have been very accommodating for carers' responsibilities, because, but I do think that what we're observing is that we are observing more research papers coming out. We are observing more across the lines, but I think there is definitely a concern because of more limited spaces in daycare facilities in terms of handling younger kids, as well as not all kids are back in school, that they're having to stay at home and study. So I do think that there are some gender issues there that we're going to have to address. I will stop there.
Abigail, thank you very much. That was very insightful, and giving us the Australian perspective with a different finance model is really interesting. So the gender challenge, of course, is only one aspect of what we are experiencing with the COVID crisis. The other important development is that different SES groups, different social groups, may be very, very differently affected by that, and that may have actually even a stronger, longer-term consequences. So I'm sure in the discussion we will come back to that. Hanming pointed out that universities have to offer something else than just knowledge. So what would that something else be? And that something else, will continue to be expensive. And if it is actually expensive, then this will have a long-term impact on who can afford this something in addition to knowledge, and who can not afford it. And if it is networking, then this is not good news for lower SES groups. And surely we will discuss that. And I knowing Steve, I am quite sure that Steve will talk a little bit about inequalities related to SES, because that has been something he has been working on that. So Steve, please.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to share my thoughts and share my screen to get some slides up. Okay. Can you see those okay? Can you see the slides okay? Yeah, okay.
That's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks for inviting me. There'll be a little bit of duplication given that in terms of what the earlier speakers have said, but I'll also say some other things I think as well. So I wanted to cover two areas under this briefing. The first of which is to make some general points about both the static and the dynamic effects of learning and earning losses. And the second is to quickly show some evidence from the very up-to-date evidence from the UK. Okay, so on the first of those, talking about learning and earning losses, it's quite good that we've one of the plus points actually about economists under COVID is that there seems to be a bigger appetite to get facts right about what's going on in the kind of contemporary economy with just-in-time and real data, which is a very good and healthy thing. And indeed, people collecting their own data much more when there's shortcomings associated with existing data to address kind of issues we might be interested in. So because of that, there's already an array of evidence on learning and earning losses that have emerged from the COVID-19 induced crisis. Now, in most settings where the evidence exists, there seems to be evidence of both learning and earning losses being unevenly distributed, as Christian just mentioned a moment ago, with both the inequality of education and labour market outcomes increasing. Another feature is that these uneven distributions feature prominently affecting some particular groups in society more. So typically losses seem to be much higher amongst younger people, and the general tendency is to exacerbate already existing inequalities. They're also gendered, although not always in the same direction, and in the labour market, they differentially affect particular groups with people in low wage work and self-employment seem to have been hit very hard in some settings. So let me talk about outcomes in this. So I think there's immediate effects that have emerged. We've seen immediate effects of learning losses. There was also worries that emerged about longer run scarring that will result from these learning and earning losses. So on learning losses, there's already quite a lot of evidence, both in terms of reduced education capacity during lockdown and subsequently, and in terms of these lower education rates impinging on test scores. So there's a nice World Bank review that Harry Patronos has written recently, showing 45 countries shut down schools during lockdown in Europe and Central Asia, the vast majority. And we know what's happened in higher education, but there's been university closures and big switches to online teaching going on. There's already evidence that education rates Both under lockdown, of course, they went down hugely, and I'll come to that, some evidence on that in a minute. There was also some direct evidence that the school closures have actually damaged test scores from some countries, and I'm sure there'll be much more of that coming out in research in due course. Of course, these learning losses of the cohorts who are going through school, Michèle's already mentioned this, are very likely to impact future university intakes and the composition of those university intakes. And indeed, the labour market earnings when the affected cohorts will enter the labour market. So I guess we can think about, short-run effects already happening and longer-run scarring effects that may emerge from these unequal learning losses that have occurred. On earnings losses, the labour market patterns have changed since the crisis emerged. Tend to vary across countries, but one very clear thing is if you think about what you might call a realistic employment rate, they've fallen strongly in most places. So this is either unemployment going up, job loss, and people transitioning into unemployment in some settings, or less so in others where governments have intervened to try and keep people employed, like the furlough scheme in the UK, furlough scheme in Germany, various other places have kept people in work. But one of the problems with that, of course, is that people aren't working any hours. And so whilst they've still got a job, they're actually not working at all. So if you compute realistic employment rates, then they also fall as well. And so we do know that spells of unemployment and non-employment can have longer term consequences. I think there's two relevant areas of that we might be thinking about in terms of the dynamics. The wage and employment scarring effects of longer duration spells of unemployment, especially long-term unemployment spells. And we've got some people who are clearly moving on to trajectories towards long-term unemployment, even though we've only been in crisis for whatever, 7 or 8 months. But there's people who lost their jobs who are clearly on a track towards long-term unemployment. And of course, that may well have longer-term consequences for them, for their families, for the communities in which they live. We know from previous recessions that there's serious scarring effects from spells of long-term unemployment. The second dimension, of course, is there's a well-established literature. There's a very nice review by Till von Wachter coming out in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about this literature. We know there's a well-established literature that people who are unfortunate enough to be born at a certain time when they enter the labour market, so by the time they enter the labour market's not doing as well as it was before. So we know that people who enter the labour market in bad times compared to good times do less well, and this often persists into the long term as well. So of course, both of these mean that the affected cohorts when they enter the labour market there may well be dynamic consequences of this in terms of labour market scarring. Okay, so I think we know that both employment rates and education rates are well below capacity already. That's having short-term effects, of course, but there may well be long-term effects that come from that unless one can think of policy responses that may be able to offset them. Okay, so that's the first part of what I want to talk about. I'm just going to give some quick evidence about what's happened in the UK. So this is work I've been involved with various co-authors, and what we've done is we've assembled evidence from a range of different primary and secondary data sources. So by primary, I mean data we've gone and collected ourselves. So through the Centre for Economic Performance at LSE, we've actually gone and collected data as well as using familiar labour force surveys and other data sets. There's a longitudinal data set in the UK called Understanding Society, which has dedicated COVID waves, which has come out very fast. So how might you look at evidence on learning and earning losses? Well, you can think about comparing what was going on before. So we obviously need a baseline to compare with. So this is the kind of baselines that we have available in these data. So it varies what transitions you can look at. Okay, so let me just show you a few things that come out of the survey. I haven't got too long to talk about it. So let me just get back. So the fourth one of these, the LSE CEP Social Mobility Survey, we surveyed just over 10,000 people in September and October of this year, asking 16 to 65-year-olds, asking them a whole range of questions about a variety of things. So within that, we obviously have people in the labour market, we have people who are in full-time education, and we also we had specific modules in there asking parents of children stuff about their children. So we can look at impacts on school children, impacts of a crisis on school children, we can look at impacts on people in full-time education, and we can look at impacts on the labour market itself. So this first chart here shows you people in full-time education, and it shows the extent of learning loss by family income. So 100% learning loss means that people didn't, that the black bar on the chart is people who didn't reported doing no learning at all in the period when we asked them since lockdown. The lighter bar is people who got as much learning as they would have done pre-crisis. So you can see there's a distribution of these things. About half, basically the education rate falls to about, in terms of time, falls to 48% overall. But you can see that this is distributed differently across people from higher income backgrounds and lower income backgrounds. And so everybody loses out in terms of their learning loss on average. But you can see it's skewed much more to people from the bottom 20% of families. So this is this inequality of people who are already not doing quite as well. And so the learning losses are more pronounced for people from the bottom quintile of the distribution. If you look at school-age children, I've got two charts here. One's very much real time, the one on the right. The one on the left shows you the percent of normal schooling time that people are engaging in during lockdown. So just concentrate on the black bar. So 42% of normal schooling time was the average education rate during lockdown. Post-lockdown, it goes up to 85%, but it's still well below the 100% that we would think was going on prior to lockdown. Children went back to school in England on the 9th of September. So this is daily school. The right-hand chart shows you daily school attendance since then. And so you can see by the time last Thursday, 7 days ago, only 86% of children were actually in school. It's even lower among secondary school children. It's about 80% there. So 1 in 5 children are still not attending school. And so obviously there's some extent of learning loss still going on right now. Again, we know this is unequally distributed. One thing I mentioned before in the labour market was this issue about computing realistic employment rates. So the UK is one of those countries where the unemployment rate hasn't gone up by very much. It's actually starting to tick up a little bit now. But up to the end of the summer, the unemployment rate didn't rise very much. And that's partly because of the furlough scheme that the government introduced. So on these charts here, the left-hand side chart is for working age adults. Actually, I should say not in full-time education. And the right-hand chart is for 16 to 25-year-olds. So the black bar here is what you might think of as a realistic employment rate. You can see the unemployment rate on the left is fairly constant. And then if you actually look at people who are employed and not working, so that's people who said they were working, they're still in work, but they worked 0 hours the week before. You can see you get a big fall of that, the employment rates in lockdown, and it hasn't recovered back to its initial levels before. This pattern is even more pronounced on the right-hand chart amongst the young people. The young people have been hit very hard in the labour market, and you can see the unemployment rate is edging up for them even by September as well. So this is this concern about people getting on these trajectories towards long-term unemployment, especially so the appetite. So another thing we asked in our survey is we asked about various potential government policies and whether people might be interested, whether people think that they'll be good things or not. So here's some attitudes from the general public. These 10,000 adults who we interviewed. This is the parents of school children, so there's about 2,000 of them in our sample. So the left-hand chart asks about whether the exams that children take in 2021, so that'll be the first big affected cohort going through the school year now who'll take their exams should be changed. The second is a rather quirky thing that we have in Britain, that actually people who are admitted on predicted grades to university rather than on actual grades. And so you can see that actually when people are asked, it's the vast majority of people who agree or strongly agree that the exams should be reformed, and so should university admissions. So it was a general appeal from the public for education reform. The second thing we asked about was in the labour market, about whether the government should pursue the introduction of job guarantees paid for by government to prevent long-term unemployment. And you can see this is pretty popular amongst the general public as well. 64% of people agree or strongly agree that this would be a good thing for government to do in the current climate. It's very interesting, actually. So we have information about the political persuasion of people as well. So even people who voted for the Conservative Party, the incumbent government in the 2019 election, over 50% of people who voted Conservative still agree or disagree, still agree that the government should introduce a job guarantee aimed to combat long-term unemployment. Okay, so just to conclude, it seems that work and education were significantly affected and continue to be following the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. The observed changes have not been shared equally. Those who've done worse to those who were doing less well pre-lockdown. And this is just talking about the short-run effects that have happened since March. These are quite sizable effects and seem to be likely to have potentially persistent effects which could generate dynamic long-run scarring. Certainly on the basis of past experience and existing evidence on learning and earning losses in previous recessions. So the prospects for future inequality evolutions don't look good right now, and they don't look good particularly for longer run social mobility. We know the two key drivers of low social mobility are higher education and higher income inequalities, or both. And both of those have been going up under the crisis. So let me conclude there. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much for this really interesting, remarks, not just about the whole COVID crisis more generally, but also about interesting evidence you put together for the UK. So let me first say, we actually open also this up to questions from the floor. So every one of you, if you have comments, please put them in the chat, and I will then read them to the speakers. So one thing, this crisis, I think Michèle mentioned that we have experience from the Great Recession and what happened after the Great Recession. It seems to me, however, that this crisis, different from the Great Recession, is not just a huge economic disaster, but it also, and I think that came through in all the different contributions we had from the panelists, it also creates differences or changes in structures. So Hanming pointed out that there will be likely changes in the way we think about education. It changes prices, but it also changes what will be on offer. Steve pointed at employment and well, unemployment and well, people who pointing to Till von Wachter's work, people who enter the labor market in a crisis may be disadvantaged. Now, this crisis is not just a crisis which doesn't offer the same number of jobs, but it seems to me that it also challenges different talents and abilities. Because, well, it changes, it may change, or if it changes the structure of our economy, we will see different people being differently affected by that. So Bob Gregory always says that there is always opportunity in every crisis. And that seems to me even more dramatic for this particular crisis, because what we may actually see is not just that the structure of educational supply is changing, that prices are changing, but also that jobs are changing, that structures are changing, and therefore that different people may differently be disadvantaged and or advantaged by this crisis. Maybe Abigail, we start with you. Do you have some thoughts about that, how that relates to Australia? You pointed out that clearly this will impact on the way we think about the Australian higher education system. But will it also create opportunities or disadvantages which are different from what we know from a previous economic crisis.
Nothing like giving me a challenging question, Kristen. I do think that there are winners and losers, and you know, what's interesting is like different countries. If I think of Australia, if I think of probably Canada, I think of the UK, is that we have had governments that have really stepped in and really bolstered the economy to help people out. But as Steve mentioned, there are these people that are getting money but aren't working. And so that's creating this kind of weird thing going on where they're not utilizing their skills, but then when things start to come back, will those jobs be available? And so I think that's a serious issue. I think there is a lot of financial fragility in our environments. So even though the governments have stepped up and are supporting the economies, I think what happens in 2021 is going to be super critical, because I think are we about to fall off this cliff, or are we going to basically kind of just continue on? And that, to me, that's what's going to impact the employment opportunities in terms of what we think about the haves and the have-nots. We know that there are some industries that have really excelled and people are doing well, but we also know that there's a lot of industries that they are in. Steve, the figures you showed in terms of the differential effects based on family income and family background, I'd be willing to bet that would be true around the world in terms of seeing those differences.
Yes, thank you. Hanming, maybe you want to give some of your thoughts, because you made the very interesting point that the pot 4 of what is on offer by universities is likely to be affected by new opportunities, which I think were probably always there, but have been dramatically accelerated through the COVID crisis, and how this affects, well, different groups in society potentially differently.
Yes. Yes. So you know, I like Abigail earlier mentioned, when the lockdown happened, many universities kind of switched to online on a dime, but typically within a week, right? So Payne started kind of a spring break. It happened right around the spring break, and essentially the university wasn't even thinking about, you know, not having the students back after spring break. But then the lockdown happened. All the students were told, you know, not to return to campus. The professors are told that we'll be switching to online learning, online teaching, just in the time window of the spring break week, right? So, and we realized that suddenly, you know, this world of online teaching is not, we are in some way kind of forced to learn how to do things virtually, how to teach virtually, how to do conferences virtually. And now we got pretty familiar with it. I think this habit of, you know, in econometric society, we have been talking about, even after the COVID crisis is over, you know, would the future conferences be more in the mode of hybrid mode, right? So have in-person together with virtual option. And that, you know, for the reason the discussion was taking place is to make conference attendance more, you know, readily accessible for people who probably don't have the budget or time to travel physically. So that thinking by economic society indicates that the you know the whatever we were forced to change during the pandemic will have long-run impacts on other things we do. For example, let me just give you one more example. So somehow university education model has always been focusing on 18 to 20-year-olds, right after they finish high school, right? and the learning was, for miraculous reasons, kind of forced to take place within 4 years, if it's a 4-year college, or 2 years, if it's a 2-year college. And there's really no good reason to why the learning should just be for people right after high school, and why should the time of college be 2 or 4 years, right? This is historical kind of just inertia. And I guess one possible reason is that once you become older, you have family, adult learning becomes a lot more costly, for not just financially, but also time-wise. But virtual learning could change all of that. So, and also the technological change is forcing, is actually making it more important to have continued lifelong learning, as technology changes much more rapidly than, the idea, the historical idea that we can use what we learned during college, right, for the remaining 30, 40 years of our adult labor market. That idea maybe, I think it's going to be outdated very soon. So there will be a large increase in demand for continuous lifelong learning and training. The adult education probably module based will be, and with certificates, will be an opportunity to embrace that, and that opportunity will be made easier. Is now made easier as more and more people now are familiar with online learning, and many platforms of providing this remote learning. It became online during the pandemic. And I think that will also force government to think about policies, maybe tax credits, and so on, to incentivize adult education, both made feasible by things we learned during the pandemic, as well as being made kind of necessary because of the rapidly changing technology and that's going on around us. So I think providing adult education tax credits will be an important thing, maybe, for governments to think about. Another thing, very quickly, I just want to add some comment on the impact of the pandemic on inequality. So definitely, it's true that the short-run impacts of the pandemic is felt very differently by different segments of the population. Michèle mentioned gender, and Steve mentioned, by social income, economic status. And in the U.S., in terms of impact on the employment, right, the pandemic is really kind of felt very differently depending on where you are in the income distribution, right? So work by Raj Chetty and his team have shown that for the highest income group, right, the pandemic essentially is over. The employment rate among the highest income group in the United States in, say, October is already higher than 0.3 percentage points higher than the pre-pandemic level. But for the lowest income group, it's still 20% below the pre-pandemic level in terms of employment rate. And in terms of the small and medium businesses, this pandemic, I think, is giving the large platform, much bigger advantage, right? So if you look at the market evaluations of big companies like Amazon, and in China, Alibaba or JD.com, they all have basically enhanced their market dominance during the pandemic, for very good reasons, because platform economy platforms have a lot of economies of scale, and the small and medium businesses will force, they all, to the extent that they survive the pandemic, they all have to embrace digitization, and digitization just comes with lots of scale of the economy, network effect, and so on, that the small, medium businesses are disadvantaged relative to the big platforms. So thinking down the road, right, government also have to think about the digitization wave that happened or accelerated during the pandemic. How should the government respond to making sure that small and medium businesses will have an equal playing field relative to these, tech giants that enjoy much higher economies of scale in the platform economy. So so these are all interesting things to think about for the government after the pandemic is over, hopefully soon.
Okay, Hanming, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts with us. Now, I would like to ask Michèle something which is related to that. And Hanming pointed out very early on that the cost of healthcare in the US has increased only half by compared to the cost of higher education. Abigail proudly pointed out the financing model in Australia, which is very similar to that in the UK, where the cost of education are only accruing after individuals actually have entered the labor market and have found a job. Now, Michèle, in Germany, there are no costs of higher education except for some negligible fees. Higher education is basically free, and so are well, many instruments of lifelong learning, which Hanming pointed out as a very important factor. So would you think that that puts Germany in some kind of advantage, or would you think that this distorts relative to countries where education is quite costly, the way this particular crisis is impacting on what is learned and how universities are affected?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. In Germany, essentially all public, higher education is essentially public by and large, and there's no tuition, zero tuition, and so it's all up to the policymakers essentially to decide. So I think that puts us in an advantage in the short run. So we've seen in the United States, for example, already, I mean, huge cuts, in the budgets of universities, already some salary cuts, my understanding, and or even frozen research budgets and so forth. We haven't seen any of that in Germany yet, just because it's been pretty stable. I mean, there is no decline in tuition revenues. At the same time, public budgets are strained and will be for years to come, because we spend so much on short-term work, on rescuing the economy, on rescuing Lufthansa, on all sorts of, rescuing Southern Europe. So my prediction is that the, public money for universities in the years to come, for sure, will be cut, or for sure not be increased, and that will, will be come with more of a delay. But we've seen that in the economic crisis, in the financial crisis as well, this delayed response. So I think it will be quite similar here. If there's time, can I share some more thoughts on the job market specifically for economists, or do you?
Yes, Michèle, let's just spend 5 more minutes, and then we come to everybody's prediction on how that actually affects higher education and the job market. There is one question from the auditorium, which is very much spot on to some of the things we have been discussing. And that question asks, that person, Anui Kalra, would like to have some comments on the indirect impact of the crisis by reducing social capital. Giving as an example that studying abroad will become, or is at the moment, extremely difficult. That, of course, is very much in line with what we discussed earlier. So online teaching can only cover certain aspects of education. Knowledge transfer may be quite easy, but building what Anui calls social capital may actually be far more difficult. Networking clearly is another aspect of that, so we will see differential outcomes, which may again affect differential parts of our society. Maybe Steve, do you want to comment on that and respond to the social capital question?
Sure. It's a good question. we know that human capital is going to be lower because of the learning losses that we've seen. The likelihood is social capital is going to be lower as well, because of a variety of things. I mean, if you're not interacting, take the case of university students who are not interacting with other university students, of course, that's going to lower social capital things, social capital aspects. Of course, there are opportunities as well. I'm just going to get the right title up on my phone. So Bob Putnam, of course, who wrote about bowling alone and the decline of social capital in the US. It's interesting that his book that came out a month ago is called The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And so he sees this as, maybe people will actually realize. So in his book, he documents the move, as he puts it, from a we society to an I society. But he's arguing that maybe you can move back in the direction of a we society where people might have more collective notions about how society would operate as well. And so in that sense, you can build social capital up in that kind of way. We think about recessions as generating opportunities for rebuilding in various dimensions. And so if there is some kind of notion of collective responsibility that may be appearing because of the crisis, you can certainly see it in support of healthcare workers in situations. But maybe you can put a positive spin on this in some kind of way. Not very good for the individuals concerned in universities and not having lectures together and not being able to interact, not very good in other contexts of social distancing either. But I mean, obviously social capital hasn't really been studied thus far so much. I don't think, unless other colleagues on the panel know about any research that's been done there. It's a very interesting question, I think, and raises, issues about wider implications, even wider implications than just the earning and learning losses that I was talking about. There's other aspects of capital, natural capital. Maybe there is an opportunity for coming out of the crisis to, obviously, something Christian touched upon, and Hanming and Abigail spoke about as well. Not leaving Michèle out, but she didn't mention this one. Is the obvious sectoral shift. Some jobs in some sectors are not coming back. So when the furlough schemes get wound down, people are going to have to move across sectors. And so, we're going to have to think about where the reskilling of workers occurs. And actually, I think Germany, winding it down its furlough scheme, at least it has a much better vocational education system and means for reskilling compared to countries like Britain and America, where it's really very, very poor in terms of operating, systems that can generate good vocational skills that can be used. And I think there's actually, that needs to be firmly on the agenda about when the furlough schemes in the countries that have them get wound down, and what's happening about skills and retraining policies as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. We are kind of coming to the end of this session, and I think Steve's mentioning of vocational training systems brings us to what I would kind of consider the last round of this panel. So this is a job market, it's the AASLE job market conference, and we haven't spoken, we spoke indirectly about it, but we haven't really spoken explicitly about PhD candidates and how they are affected, how the funding model of universities is affected. And I know that Michèle has already prepared a slide for that. So I suggest that in the last round, and we are running out of time, so this needs to be very brief, each one of you gives some views about the longer term effects the crisis has on the higher education sector, on the PhD job market and PhD education more generally. And I suggest we start with Michèle. Sorry for having interrupted you a little bit earlier, but now is the opportunity to share your slides with us.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let me. Okay, so I'll try to keep this brief, but I wanted to show some numbers on the PhD job market for economists specifically, because I think that's of great interest to a lot of these attending this conference. So I think it's been pretty clear there are fewer job openings this year, especially in the United States. In the very short term, I think in Europe, there's actually many grant-funded postdoc positions, just because, we need to basically understand the crisis. So there's a lot of, data collection efforts and so forth, and money being poured into that, but that's specific for postdoc positions. ERC funding, by the way, is very likely to be cut over the next years. So that's something also to be concerned about, and something maybe we all as researchers need to lobby against, because it's not 100% decided yet. I've also spoken to many people who are postponing the market. I'm a little bit worried that will mean next year's market will be even worse. There's an increased supply from double cohorts, and still the economy won't look any better, I think. The public budget, so coming back to the European universities, are all strained because of the stimulus money. So I worry there will be less public money for universities and for quite a while. I mean, maybe not 10 years down the road, but let's say the next 5 years, I'm a little bit worried. One reason for hope is maybe the increased appreciation for science and research. And so we understand to solve this particular crisis, we do need scientists, we need researchers. So maybe that will tilt the public in favor of giving more money to higher education. It's just a hope. Very briefly, these are some numbers from economic job market. I just downloaded this yesterday. These are the most recent numbers comparing, for different years, all the ads. So what you can see, right? So look at the very last bars here. This is, of course, it's been increasing over time. But you see basically this year, the job openings, the advertisement on econ job market so far are down, but not by a huge amount. So that, is a good sign, I think. These are also the ads cumulatively. So maybe to some extent, so the turquoise line here, that's this year. So maybe partly it's just a delay in the interviews, or sorry, in the postings, because university needed some more time to figure out whether they have an opening. And maybe also the timing is less crucial than in normal years because it's all decentralized anyways. This is on the demand side, right? So how many people are looking for jobs? These are the unique new applicants on econ job market. That seems to be a little bit up from last year. So, there's more students looking for jobs. And then maybe the last thing I wanted to point out, there was an AEA ad hoc committee also on the job market, and they looked at the job openings in the JOE, right? So econ job market is only a subset. JOE, I think, gives a clearer picture. And from that, actually looks worse. Job openings on JOE are down 30% from 2019. There's a typo here. 30%, that's quite sizable. Full-time academic jobs in the US are even down by 56%. And these are numbers from, early December, so quite recent numbers. Full-time academic jobs outside the US are down 25%. And the non-academic jobs, that's sort of the best. They're only down 20%. And on JOE, at least, there's also fewer people looking for jobs. So that could, at least in terms of non-academic jobs, could almost cancel out. But for academic jobs, it doesn't look so good. And that's, I think that's all I have to say. So I had some thoughts on policies, but I mean, more generally, I think I'll quit that. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michèle. That was extremely informative. Abigail, I was told that universities in Australia are not hiring at all. So is that the case, or how does it look like for your region, and what are your thoughts on how the job market is affected?
Yeah, so there's the Institute, and then there's the Economics Department, and there's what's going on. So let me first talk more broadly, and then I'll mention what we're doing in the Institute, because we are a little bit different. And this may be some insights for people on the job market. So, what I can tell you is that for the I'm going to talk first for the University of Melbourne. We were expecting massive budget cuts because of a decrease in revenue. It's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. So in terms of, in general, what the different universities are doing different things, but I think in general, what I'm observing is that most universities are saying, should we start having a smaller footprint? And I think they're thinking about, should we have this smaller footprint, because they are probably thinking about, have we become too reliant on international students? So that was a movement that was already starting, and it's just kind of escalated. So that's one point. The good news, we have introduced, and I'm sure a lot of other universities are doing this, early retirement schemes, right, which is going to get the tail end out. So maybe we're not hiring this year, but if we have people picking up on early retirement, that is going to potentially create some positions down the road. The third scheme that some universities, at least our university, has done is allow people to do a voluntary redundancy. In this academic year, the attitude is, if someone in your department says, I want to raise my hand for voluntary redundancy, the department doesn't get to fill that position. It's a redundancy. So I do think it is going to be a very hard market in Australia. But you know, the Institute, what I have to say, so for Melbourne Institute, what I will tell you is that we are probably about 85% externally funded, and this is a year to be 85% externally funded because we've been kind of protected against tuition revenues. So are we hiring? Yes, but we're hiring fixed term postdoc positions. Last year I was hiring, you know, continuing positions or tenure track positions. So I think it's going to be hard in Australia, but I think it also is demonstrating kind of this adaptation in which candidates really need to demonstrate their value, their worth, their interest in policy, their interest in serious scientific inquiry. Like, it's just, they really have to be super, you know, kind of, I figured this out for what I'm doing, and then I'm adaptable. I think being adaptable is going to be really critical in this year's market. The last thing that I will mention is that I think as universities are thinking about smaller footprints, there's been increasing pressure around teaching a little bit more. So I think that's the other aspect in terms of getting an offer where you don't teach for a few years. I'd be interested to hear what's going on in other countries and whether you think that's going to change, at least temporarily.
Okay, thanks, Abigail. So a lot of darkness in Australia, but there is some.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Some light at the end of the tunnel, represented by the Melbourne Institute. So jobs are temporary, but for those of you who are looking for jobs, there are jobs to have. We are really running out of time. So Hanming, will you just perhaps share your kind of concluding thoughts with us in a few sentences, and then we turn to Steve.
Okay, I'll be very brief. So Michèle has the data to speak for itself, and this year the job market, you know, for econ PhD job market, I think is, you know, this negative impact is pretty obvious. Actually, the supply side, the number of students going on the market, you know, is down a little bit, but not as much as on the demand side. The demand side, I think Michèle also pointed out that the industry versus academic job are somewhat felt differently, right? So universities are really cutting the number of tenure track position postings because you know, in the short run we understand, but I think faculty is not hired for the short-term purpose, right? But I think even for the long run, the uncertainty about student enrollment and how this pandemic will impact the higher education for years to come will make administrators very hesitant in increasing hiring. So students on the market this year, you know, I wish all of them best luck, but also for students who are in the pipeline of the PhD, I think the perspective may be that first of all, the location-wise, I think you know, the the world is the market, not just focusing on the US or Europe or Australia. I think other Asian countries broadly, just everywhere in the world might be something that you should open up for the future job prospects, and also industry jobs are more likely to be the future destination. So I think just be more open-minded, both in location and in the skills that you acquire that can prepare you for different kind of jobs.
Okay, so what's important is flexibility, and looking at things one would usually not look for. The world is large, and there is opportunity everywhere. Steve, maybe 2-3 sentences, and then I think we have to conclude.
Yeah, so I guess I'd return to the point I made in my talk about these scarring effects, and I guess the job market is a little bit like the current job market for economists is one of these entering the labour market in bad times scenarios, and that's where we are. I mean, I don't have the precise numbers for the UK, but I think anecdotally it's rather like the US, maybe a little bit more muted. I mean, there are, there obviously are vacancies, but there's not as many as usual, and so it's a tough market to be entering into. I think Michèle makes the point completely correctly, of course, though, that the coming cohorts who are going to be entering the labour market, going on the job market, and indeed entering the labour market, it's perhaps even more significant for them, in the sense that the various governments that have undertaken such big kind of government borrowing deficits, that's going to come back and have consequences, and that's going to have consequences for people entering the labour market, not just this year, but in coming years, I think, as well. And so we need to think about how we can cushion that for people and try and improve prospects, both through government policy, I think, but also through the way that we function and operate in the job market as well. Some really serious creative thinking needs to be done to make the situation better for people if we can do that in some kind of way.
Okay, Steve, thanks a lot. So we are coming to the end of this, I think, extremely interesting and insightful discussion. I, for my part, learned a lot from the speakers, and I'm extremely grateful to each of you to join us, and particularly to Hanming, who I hope will get a good cup of coffee now, who got up very early. I think this was really great, and I think it also shows the breadth of interesting questions which are arising out of this crisis, which can be and will certainly be studied in the near future. So thank you very much for joining us. Now let me just say, so this is part of we intended to have a conference this year in China. That because of COVID was cancelled, and we tried to keep the job market going nevertheless. So this is part of the AASLE job market. We will continue tomorrow, 2:30 Singapore time, 2:30 p.m. So please join us to listen to some of the candidates. We are doing exactly what Hanming suggested. We are trying to become more international, to offer Asian jobs to Europeans and European jobs to Asians, etc., etc. Please come to join us. I would also like to mention that the recording of this panel will go on the job markets website as well as the AASLE website in the next few days. So for anybody who joined late, or you want to send that to your friend or grandmother or somebody who's interested in these subjects, please feel free to do so. It will be on the website. Now, this, of course, would not have been possible without the work of the administrator. Maria has been absolutely fantastic in getting all that going. And so I think we are all very, very grateful for the great work she has been doing. Jiangmin and Daiji and Jessica have also been very active of preparing this conference, and I'm just want to express my thanks and gratitude on behalf of the society to all these people. Okay, so that's it. We are coming to an end. Thank you very much again for being available and for joining. Bye bye.
Thank you, Christian. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.